Today I'm in the Warden and Ellesmere area, in an area just outside of Toronto called Scarborough, and I'm headed towards an all-time great hockey player, Tim Hortons' original house in Toronto. And this house he moved into back in 1952 with his family. He had a wife and 4 daughters. And he raised his young family at this house here on Warden Avenue, 1382 Warden Avenue. And given that it's been 60 years since Tim Hortons' company began, and what a company it is in terms of the effect and the imprint it has left on the Canadian people. I mean, how can you go about without thinking of Timmy's coffee and donuts as Tim Hortons? And Tim Hortons was considered one of the best hockey players of all time. He's in the top 100 in terms of hockey defensemen. He won 4 Stanley Cups while on the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he played for 24 seasons, most of which he played in Toronto. And 4 Stanley Cups, we could only dream of winning a Stanley Cup in Toronto again. This house I'm coming up on, where he lived in Toronto, and the first property he lived in, his wife stated in her book that they bought this bungalow, and it's a 3-bedroom house. And Lori, his wife, who has since passed, they bought this bungalow sight unseen. It hadn't even been constructed, but she wanted him to be close to the Toronto Maple Leafs team when he was playing. And at the time he was playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs, back in the 50s and 60s, his salary was $9,000 a year. So he actually had to work 2 jobs. He was on the Toronto Maple Leafs, and he also worked for a retail brewery and a gravel company that was owned by one of the Leafs owners at the time. So I'm coming up on the bungalow right now, and there was a city councillor back in, I do believe it was 2009, who wanted to make this house a heritage site because of the impact that Tim Hortons had, not only on hockey, being a hockey great, but also on the fact that he created a coffee phase in Canada that has not been beat in terms of its bite in terms of Canada. So Tim Hortons lived in this house in 1952, and from what I can see, it still hasn't gotten any recognition in terms of its history. And since Tim Hortons is celebrating its 60 years in business this year, it started back in 1964, the Tim Hortons company, I think this house should have some sort of heritage status. And it seems to have been forgotten. So I haven't seen much research in regards to any heritage status for this particular house in which Tim Hortons lived with his 4 daughters. Last time I saw that this house was for sale was back in 2016, and it sold for $700,000. It's still the original house here. It's got a driveway. It's really tiny. But at one time, Tim Hortons and a couple of famous hockey players would go into that door. There's nothing as special about this house. It looks like any other bungalow in the Scarborough borough, but I'm just going to give you a view of the side. I noticed somebody entering while I was recording, and then they peeked out the window. I guess they don't realize they live in the Hockey Hall of Fame Tim Hortons at one time house. But nonetheless, I'm here. This is the back of the bungalow. And it looks like they've turned the backyard into some sort of car park. And that is still the original bungalow. I really do hope they give this house heritage status. Good old Timmy's.